Wednesday, May 20th, 2026. Hello, I'm John Michael Chambers, and welcome back to Conversations of Consequence, where I feature some of the important voices of our times to weigh in on the incredible events that are unfolding before our very eyes in this global defense war as we fight to take back our country, restore our freedoms, and enter into the golden age. And joining us today for an engaging conversation is my very special guest, Dr. Jerome Corsi. All right, let's begin. Dr. Corsi has published over 30 books, 6 of which were New York Times bestsellers, including 2 #1 New York Times bestsellers, as I've stated. He's earned a bachelor's in political science and economics from Case Western Reserve University and received a PhD in political science from Harvard University. Back in the 1980s, Jerome Corsi received a top secret clearance to work with the State Department on terrorism and hostage survival issues, and he published a computer model that successfully predicted the outcome of terrorist events, which was published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, a peer-reviewed game theoretic journal also published by Yale University. All right, well, please welcome Dr. Jerome Corsi to Conversations of Consequence. Welcome, sir.
My pleasure. Great to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Before we get into the issues of the day, election theft, various things that I'd really love you to weigh in on, I'd like to gain a little insight for our audience. Tell us, if you will, if you care to share, where you were born and raised, what was life like growing up for the young Jerome Corsi, and what was it that led you into your life's work, PhD in the political science arena?
Well, I was born in East Cleveland, Ohio, in 1946. I'll be 80 this year, and in August. And it was kind of a middle-class neighborhood. I lived in a two-story frame house with my grandparents, my Irish grandparents owned. And my childhood, I remember distinctly the 50s very clearly. I learned to read very early and was always interested in books and writing and politics. I had a very clear understanding of politics early on. So even at age 5 and 6, I would be watching the news and following politics and understanding it. And it was always it didn't take much instruction. It just simply was obvious to me. So I can remember I was always more conservative. My father worked for the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen at that time, one of the railroad operating unions that was headquartered in Cleveland. And he started out on the Trainman News. He eventually became public relations director and acted as a lobbyist in Washington. I spent a good deal of time with him in many ways. And he influenced me greatly in politics. We would always discuss politics. I was, I think, always more conservative than my father. I can remember even in 1952, when Eisenhower was running for president against Adlai Stevenson. And I was I guess I was 5 years old or so at the time. I was born in 1946. And so, I remember distinctly the Life magazine arrived at the house around, mail arrived around noon or so. And the Life magazine of those days had a big picture in the back. And the back page was a big picture. The picture happened to be Adlai Stevenson on a dais. And the photographer had taken him, looking up at him, and you could see his legs were crossed and you could see the sole of his shoe, which had a hole in it. Okay, well, at that time, that was not uncommon. But I waited for my father to come home because I wanted to show him. I said, how could you, be in support of this guy who is not even able to get himself a pair of shoes he's going to run the country, but his shoes have got a hole in them. This is the guy you're going to pick to run the country. And instead of General Eisenhower, who had won World War II, and I was aware of General Eisenhower, in terms of basically what he had done. And my father said, well, of course, he wasn't taken back by that. He said, well, Jerry, you don't understand. That's just how hard Adlai Stevenson is working for the people. Okay, so immediately I was, understanding that my dad's perspective was much more to the left and was much more concerned about the workers. I was more concerned about running an efficient country, and I thought Eisenhower as a general was a much better candidate. But that's when I started out at 5 years old, and through much of my career, my life, I really was not very fond of going to school. I remember I was a truant from kindergarten. So my mother took me to kindergarten the first day I left and came home and told her they let us out early. And after a while, I mean, I did that for a few days. And my mother said, "Well, Jerry, they don't let you out early every day." And so I said, "Well, I think, maybe mother, we better go meet the principal." She said, "Why are we going to go see the principal?" I said, "Well, sooner or later, we're going to be talking to the principal. We might as well just go introduce ourselves because it's going to be a problem." And I remember the meeting. My mother was there and the principal and a couple of other people. And they said, "Mr. Corsi, we think we ought to put your son in a special school. He's bored here. He can read and etc. These other children have got to do a lot more. He's just going to be bored." And my mother said, "No, no." My mother was a very beautiful woman, redheaded, fiery Irish woman, a first generation American. And she said, no, that she wasn't going to allow that because then I wouldn't be socially adjusted if I was put in a special school. And I said, "Well, Mother, do you think I'm socially adjusted now?" And basically, I lost that argument, and and so for the entire time I was in grade school, I mostly didn't go, and she never really did know how to control it because I would miss the bus. I'd do all kinds of things. I'd walk out of school. If the teacher was not solving a problem quick enough, I would go to the board and show the teacher how to solve the problem and leave. And so it was pretty much the longer I went to school, the less I attended. By the time I got to Harvard, I had finished all my coursework. In the first semester, it was supposed to take you 2 years. And I really I wanted to take my general exams early, and they fought with me. Basically, James Q. Wilson, who was head of the department, political science and Department of Government at Harvard, called me in to see him. He said, "Mr. Corsi, we're not going to give you a PhD at the end of 2 years." And I said, and I had got a National Science Foundation at Harvard, a scholarship. I was paying nothing to it at Harvard. They were paying me a monthly stipend of $1,000 a month. I had already published 3 books under my own name as an undergraduate. And so he said, "Well, why? I've got my dissertation about written." He said, "It took me 6 years. You're not going to do it in 2." And so I basically said, "Well, will you continue paying me?" He said, "Yes." And we worked out a deal. I said, "Well, what do you want me to do for the rest of the years you want me? How many years?" He said, "I'll give you a PhD in 4." And so basically I asked to be able to go to visit teachers and at Harvard and at MIT, and they would introduce me and I could work whomever I wanted to work with. And I spent a couple of years just meeting professors and working with them on my own kind of self-directed program, and rarely attended any classes at all. And, but had a good education reading and meeting professors. And I would read what these professors had written, call them up, ask to see them, and then start spending time with them. And I did that with a number of great professors. I kind of devised my own curriculum, and but I knew I was never going to quite fit in to the way things were designed because I hadn't fit in so far, and I figured my life was going to take a lot of turns and be fairly disrupted because I wasn't fitting in to the normal structure of life and what was expected of me to behave well. And this guy would, when I left the school and even in grade school, I'd go to the library and just read books all day. So by the time I was done grade school, I'd read most of the books in the library. And so, that was the type of thing I did. And I realized that was not going to be very well adjusted with others in my age who were not even, who were struggling even to read a few books. And so when I got to Harvard, I remember going to Widener Library and walking around, and my major conclusion the first days there was that you didn't have to be at Harvard to be included in Widener Library, because very few of the books I encountered were written by Harvard professors. So those were the kinds of ways I was challenging all of my life, and I don't think it's ever stopped.
Wow, what an extraordinary journey. 5 years old. It sounds like it's in your DNA at such a young age to have traveled the path and the road that you've chosen with your extraordinary knowledge and bucking the systems and succeeding through it. It's pretty extraordinary. I want to, if you will, sir, comment a bit. Back then, obviously things have changed. You know, we had Walter Cronkite giving us the news at 5 o'clock, and so the news is. Let's do a comparison of how news was then to where it is today, as well as politics, the landscape of politics. You can clearly see the differences between then and now. How would you like to comment on that a bit?
Well, the news started being really only about 15 minutes. I mean, at the 6:30 or so in the evening. I mean, most of the news was local. In Cleveland, they had a woman named Dorothy Fulltime who did news, and she was pretty old even when I was watching it to start with. Of course, when television came on about 1948, it was a tiny little Philco TV with the test pattern on it most of the day, and so
Yeah.
I would watch the news and get. So by the time Huntley Brinkley came on, they went to a half an hour, and that was revolutionary. And the news, I always had a feeling was kind of, since I'd spent time with my father in Washington, and had seen the Kennedys, had been, the McClellan Committee hearings were going on, and I was very much involved in wanting to watch those. Before then, the Kefauver Committee hearings, crime hearings, were televised. In the 50s. I would come home and watch those instead of going to school. They were crime hearings. I thought they were fascinating. And so I would, absorb it all, even at a very early age, and understand. My dad would ask me questions about it. And I would say things even as a kid. And the next day, the president would be saying the same things. And I realized that my dad was, in a circle where he was discussing things, and thoughts we had shared got passed on even at a very early age. And I was aware of, this was the post-war period and the beginning of the Cold War, and I was aware of what that meant. I could remember discussions in the United Nations when Russia walked out and we decided to go to war in Korea. That was very young, and I understood what that meant. And so I was, realizing right after World War II, we were back at war again. And as I followed that in the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Cleveland Press, I realized that it was not going particularly well. And I couldn't figure out why we were involved in such a regional war. And, beginning to understand at that time we had nuclear weapons and none of the other countries did. And begin to understand that, the advent of nuclear weapons, especially when Russia and then China got nuclear weapons, was changing the world fundamentally. So I followed politics all this time, and I don't think I ever was not following it and understanding it very deeply beyond what was being explained in the news. I had a much deeper understanding of what the real events were, and able to analyze them and effectively comprehend that there were forces at work that were really not being explained to the American people, and watch the McCarthy era. There were very interesting times through the 50s, and I followed them very closely, even as a child.
Yes, and I understand you've done some study and some work and publishing on the JFK assassination. So you go from Eisenhower, now we fast forward to JFK. Any reflections on that time in history?
Well, I always liked JFK. I was very much in favor of him, even though he was a Democrat. And
Hmm.
I thought he was able to articulate a vision of the country and the future that was looking to a new generation. And of course, that was the theme of his first inaugural. And Kennedy had followed his campaign and, knew the power of his father and the people around him promoting him. The day Kennedy was assassinated, I was a senior and I was 17 years old in college and had been in Washington, had met some of the people who were around JFK, including the mobsters who were close to Kennedy. And over the years, I spent time with those mobsters. And I realized the day it happened, it was announced at the end of the day, and I was in a physics class, and I had the car that day and to go to a doctor's appointment. I turned on the radio, and they were replaying his first inaugural. And I knew they would only do that if he had been killed. And so therefore I realized he was dead. And fundamentally the world
Yeah.
changed. And then that evening as I watched it and they started producing the evidence on Lee Harvey Oswald, I didn't believe any of it. I knew it was a setup from the very beginning. And I knew that they were lying.
Hmm.
And so I had assumed from the very beginning that he was killed by the government and by the mob. I had been aware of the issues that were surrounding Kennedy, from the Bay of Pigs through the uh, Cuban Missile Crisis. I knew the conflicts with the mob that Kennedy's father was really prosecuting the Eastern mob because he had never been accepted by the Eastern mob as a Irishman, and he was more aligned with the Western mob, which was more the Elkins family, who originally had set up Vegas and Reno, and the Teamsters were moving in on them. That's what the McClellan Committee hearings were all about. And I realized that Bobby Kennedy had this conflict with Jimmy Hoffa. The Kennedys were at odds with the Eastern mob. The Kennedys were clearly not wanting to get into. Jack Kennedy did not like to be lied to. So one thing, I knew Kennedy was a playboy, but he had it was a remarkably quick study, and you could watch him in a hearing, and he might be distant, not paying attention. Then when it came his time to question, he would kind of look into the distance, and he pulled it all together. And his questioning could be very brilliant, much more than he'd been prepared for. And so I realized that I think he grew in the office. And he'd been lied to over the Bay of Pigs. I read about that. And I've written 2 books on the assassination. I write about the Elkins family. That's a version of the assassination that most people don't know. And I think even though I've written about it, it did not get the attention it deserves. I'd still like to write a little bit more about that. But the point is that Kennedy knew that he'd been lied to over the Bay of Pigs, which was a very complex story because in the last debate, Nixon had been planning as his October surprise that we would invade Cuba while he was vice president, and that he had been working with Allen Dulles and the CIA planning the Bay of Pigs. And the idea was that we would invade with this army that was supposed to be Cuban, rebels or Cuban trying to take back their country. It was actually a paid CIA army trained in Nicaragua and trained in Guatemala by CIA operatives, and including Howard Hunt, and that the invasion was going to fail, and we would then bring in the military through B-26s, and the U.S. Military would take over Cuba. Nixon would be vice president, and that would sweep him into victory. Okay, well, Kennedy found out about it through the Elkins connections, and they briefed him. So when it came Kennedy's time to talk about Cuba, Kennedy said, well, I think we ought to invade. Now, Nixon was a debater, and Nixon knew that Kennedy had been briefed on his plans to invade. So Nixon immediately said, oh, no, we can't invade because that would be the wrong thing to do. Nixon was a debater, and he thought whatever Kennedy said, he had to counter. So when Kennedy got to be president, the CIA came around and said, you remember that fourth debate when you said we should invade Cuba? Well, we're going to hold you to that, or we're going to explain to the world what you did. So Kennedy was trapped, and he had to go along with it. And they also knew about Kennedy's philandering, and they were happy to bribe him or blackmail him at that time. And the CIA and J. Edgar Hoover always had chapter and verse on Kennedy's escapades. And so Kennedy went along with it. But when he realized that he'd been lied to about the plan, and he was down in Miami, and they called him up and said, the invasion's failing, we want to send in the B-26s, he told them to stand down. And then he went public and took blame for the Cuban Missile Crisis failing. But from that moment on, Kennedy knew that he was not in control of the government. The government's not being run by him. They didn't listen to him. They did bureaucracy, and especially the Dulles brothers were running their own form of policy and their own version of the United States. And I was aware of this. And I knew that the dynamics were there. And then when the Cuban Missile Crisis came along, Kennedy, the military wanted to invade. Curtis LeMay was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was happy to go to nuclear war. He thought we had sufficient first strike capability over Russia, and he thought this was the time to go to. And Kennedy was astounded that our military is willing to have a nuclear war over Cuba. And that's when he came up with the idea of doing the blockade and averted nuclear war. But we were within hours of a nuclear war that the military of the United States at that time would have welcomed. And I was aware of all this. So when Kennedy was killed, it wasn't a surprise. And that a part of the reason he was killed, in large part, not the only reason, was he was pulling out of Vietnam. Kennedy in the 1950s had gone to Vietnam, and he'd seen the corruption when the French were there. So he knew it was an impossible situation. We weren't going to be able to do anything to be able to have an honest dealings in Vietnam because it was being run as a drug passageway. Drugs were coming out of Southeast Asia starting at the end of World War II. And our CIA was running the drug trade in conjunction with others who were, actives. And it was largely an intelligence operation going back to the early days prior to World War II. And Chiang Kai-shek's army was largely a drug-running organization. And Kennedy knew that. So Kennedy was not going to get drawn into a war in Vietnam, which he thought was a quagmire. And he knew the CIA had its own purposes, which was to develop an army different than we had fought with in World War II. They wanted a quick response army, and they wanted to test the air cav and the types of responsiveness we have in a military today, which is fundamentally different than a army which was going to fight, sieged battles and, have generals like Patton, Third Army going across Europe. Those days were over. And when we had the type of air power we had in World War II, and we had nuclear weapons. So the military wanted to use Vietnam as an experiment. They also wanted to preserve the drug running. It's a great source of revenue. And Kennedy knew this. And I knew it too. And so, when Kennedy was killed, I didn't believe a word about Lee Harvey Oswald. I knew the whole thing was a story that didn't fit together. And I actually thought that day that I would, the day Kennedy was, that weekend, between the time he was shot on Friday and buried on Monday, I thought maybe I would write the book that would explain how he was killed. And I've done that with Dr. Mantic. Dr. Mantic looked at the autopsy evidence more than anyone else. He's a radiation oncologist, and he did measurements of the inch by inch, using an odometer, not an odometer, but an instrument that measures light coming through the X-rays. He was able to determine that all three of the extant X-rays of Kennedy's skull are forged with masks to hide shots from the front, but there's clear evidence of two frontal shots in the skull X-rays of JFK, and one that hit him in his temple, and the right hand. You can see the trail of the bullet across the top of the head. Another that hit him by the temple, this bone here, and blew out the back of his head. And the CIA knew this. Certainly, the Secret Service riding with Kennedy knew this, and they were all lying and fabricating the evidence of the Warren Commission. So that was, I think, that those years were part of my awakening to the news stories we were being told were largely fiction, and that there was a deep state operative with a different true story of history, which was much more nefarious.
Thank you, sir, for that. I want to pedal back just a couple of things on the JFK subject before we move into some of the current events of the day. You mentioned early on your interactions with the mob that was associated with the Kennedy circle, if you will, at the time. Is there anything that you can share with us about that relationship? What was the nature of it, and what did you glean from it?
I was always fascinated with the mob. I mean, they had run a lot of the country at that time, and had a code of ethics that, even though they were criminals, they were, there were certain rules and certain ways of behavior that they respected. And so I was aware of the Eastern mob and the Western mob, and the fact that they had, I can remember a couple of stories that I can tell you that were kind of fascinating. I'm not sure I've written about these yet, but so in the Elkins, in Globe, Arizona, which is a small town outside of Phoenix in the White Mountains, up by Miami, which is a copper resource, copper mines in Miami dominate the city. We had this dinner one night with the mob who were all gathered together. J.B. Elkins was kind of the leader of the mob. He was a guy who was the main figure, and Amy Elkins was like kind of the genius of the mob. He was younger, son really of J.B. And they were arguing. They were saying that, they were lamenting the days. They said, when we first came out here in the West, it was wide open. There was the federal government wasn't out here, and we were still, we were the bad guys. We were the law. Like going back to Wild Bill Hickok and all the others, the greatest gun shooters would ultimately get asked to be the law. And said, now we've lost the frontier. The feds are in here. They're arresting people, and they're shutting down the mob activities. We can't have gambling. We can't have bootlegging. We can't do anything without being caught. And so therefore we're running out of frontier. And so they said, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to be adapted when we have no more frontier? And their solution was, they said, well, when there's no more frontier, well, we're going to be useful because we'll go out into outer space and we'll encounter the aliens, and they'll need us again. We'll be the guys that they send out there to fight the aliens. That'll be our new frontier. And Jack Kennedy was sitting there, and he says, you don't mind if I borrow that? Well, his first term, the theme that they used was the new frontier. And it came from that conversation. We needed a new frontier, and it was going to be space. And that's why Jack Kennedy said, we're going to go to the moon and beyond. And it was all out of the recognition that this is where a certain breed of people were adapted to be on the frontier. We ran out of frontiers. They were maladapted and became mobsters. And so they were anxious to have Space Force and anxious to have us recognize that we're aliens, and they go fight them. And it's kind of a bizarre story, but these are the kinds of things that were the basis of a lot of themes that developed in politics for reasons that most people would have no idea of.
Yes, I'd like to get to UFOs under President Trump in just a moment. Just in wrapping up the JFK story here, would it be fair to say that there may have been a combination of reasons that they took JFK out? You mentioned, of course, him not wanting to expand into Vietnam. We know about Executive Order 11110, restoring silver certificates, dealing a blow to the Fed. We know he said, before I leave this high noble office, I will splinter the CIA into a million pieces. And he spoke about the dangers of secret societies. Would you say the culmination of those things is what led to his death, or would it be something else?
No, I think all of those factors were relevant. JFK realized that he was going to be targeted. He had a death wish. He had this poem he always recited from World War I about "I have a rendezvous with death." JFK had a congenital spine defect. And he had Addison's disease, and he knew he was going to end up his life in a wheelchair, and he didn't want to end up his life as a cripple. So he had a fascination with dying young, and the Elkins family warned him in the Oval Office that he was going to be shot. The story was going to be a rifle with a sight, long range shot from a tall building, and Kennedy basically said he was going to do what he had to do. There were 3 assassination attempts on Kennedy. The first 2, I think, were warm-up, one in Chicago and one in Miami, both of which failed. And then I think the real setup was with Dallas. The CIA had Dallas under its control. The families of the CIA were also the politicians in Dallas. They controlled the police department. The setup in Dealey Plaza was ideal for a crossfire. And Kennedy knew he'd been warned about this, but he didn't take precautions. And, it was almost suicide by assassination. And I think when the shooting started, Kennedy had an incident or two when he recognized what was going on. And of course, that was the day I think America really fundamentally changed. And to those of us who were aware, we began aware of the power of what we now call the deep state and how opposed it really was to our national interests.
Yes. 2 more things. I'm sorry, I'm still on the Kennedy issue, but I'm taking advantage of this opportunity for you to share what you've experienced and what you've analyzed and what you know. LBJ, an accomplice, would that be a fair statement?
I think LBJ was aware of the plot. I think he had to have approved it. I think he knew it was going to happen. And he was clearly the beneficiary. And so he had to have agreed that he was going to rescind Kennedy's orders and then we were going to go into Vietnam. And that was a major part that happened within hours of Kennedy's death. And so the CIA was back where it wanted to be, in control now of the dynamics. And Johnson marched us steadily into war. And that would not have happened had Kennedy been alive.
Yep.
I was never fond.
Question. Thank you.
I was never fond of Lyndon Johnson. I felt like, I remember when Lyndon Johnson came out that night, I was watching TV and he came out at Andrews Air Force Base and he said, he was talking about the assassination. He said, I need your help. I want to ask for your help and God's. And I thought to myself again, this guy can't even do a proper phrase. The phrase would have been, I'm asking for your help and the help of God. You would make it a parallel structure. He wasn't, he didn't have I was criticizing his literary skills the night of the assassination and thought this guy is a bumpkin.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Cuba, obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you shared with us, your views of how that played out. Now we have Cuba front and center again today. What's your comments on what you see taking place right now within the present administration's operation as it relates to Cuba? Because I see some big changes about to take place. What do you see?
Well, yes, I think uh, President Trump is effectively going to end the regime and restore, get rid of communism. The vision that uh, I remember a seminar I was in at Harvard was on Western Europe. It was a graduate seminar, and George Ball attended it. He was very well known as an Undersecretary of State in the Kennedy administration, and he asked the graduate students to go around the table and tell them what the world configuration would be like 50 years hence in the future. And
Mm-hmm.
all the seminars on Western Hemisphere, so I was kind of sitting in the middle of the class and around this table, and everyone had said, well, it was going to be Western Europe and the United States doing this and that. And it got to me, and I said, well, I think everybody's forgetting something, and that is that there'll be three major powers. There'll be the United States, Russia, and China. And I said, I think we will each have our spheres of influence. The United States will be Western Hemisphere. Russia will covet Europe. It will be satisfied with Eastern Europe and part of Asia. And China will want Asia. And we're going to have to learn how to coexist. Well, George Ball said, I think that's right. Okay, so I've felt like what Donald Trump is conceptualizing, and I've talked about this before, is that our security going into the future is going to be conceptualized as Western Hemisphere security. That's why Donald Trump is talking about Greenland and Canada. He's seeing security being from the Arctic to the Antarctic, and they're calling it the Donroe Doctrine, the extension of the Monroe Doctrine. And so Cuba has got to come into a line with U.S. interests, which means it can no longer be communist. And that, again, would apply to Venezuela and several other countries. And ultimately, Canada will have to be aligned with the United States, and we will control Greenland. Because, again, a large part of war in the future is going to be conducted from the poles, and it's largely going to be conducted from space, which it already is being done, because our guidance systems and our communication systems will demand that we have hemispheric control, and if we will have to contain Russia to some extent in Western Europe, but Western Europe's already becoming Islamicized and is becoming unimportant in world affairs. Go back to fighting what they were fighting in the 1500s with the battle against Christianity and Islam is recurring in Western Europe right now. And so, Russia is economically much weaker than the United States, and China is too. But they are, militarily very strong with nuclear weapons. And so we're going to have to find a way that the three of us coexist. And the only solution, which I've argued since then, is to have peace through prosperity. In other words, we've got to make sure that the world moves towards a middle class standard. Even Aristotle's fundamental principle in the politics was that a stable society could only exist if it had a stable middle class, because a stable middle class would not go to war. When the middle class gets disrupted, the potential occurs for a society to decline or for wars to occur. And I've encouraged the application of those principles. That seminar was probably in 1970 or 71 in that period of time. I've been arguing these principles since then, and still consider that Donald Trump on things like the Abraham Accords, things like about is talking about ending wars. You can't establish peace through war. A war just sets up the condition for the next war, because those who are killed have relatives and friends and etc. who then build a resentment, which builds to the next war. And we've got to get beyond that if we're going to have true peace in the United States. And it may take an external threat, like threat from space, to unify us on Earth to stop our, fighting against each other. But certainly Trump is aware of the need to balance power against China and Russia and to consolidate the Western Hemisphere, which he's doing.
Yes. That's a great analysis. Thank you for sharing that with us. The Western Hemisphere aspect, Cuba, Venezuela, and other countries. You mentioned Canada, Greenland, and probably South America countries as
Yeah,
well
South
as
America
this
definitely.
expands.
Mhm.
Yeah. I want to ask you, you mentioned earlier Space Force, unless I misunderstood. When was Space Force conceptually birthed?
Well, Kennedy was thinking about it in the 1950s because he was aware. I mean, the 1950s was the first development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. And Werner von Braun, who developed the V-2 weapon, was brought over and was running the United States space program aimed with Kennedy at going to the moon. And that, we needed intercontinental ballistic missiles to develop the delivery system for nuclear warheads and nuclear war. And that was developed in the 1950s. So the idea of having a space force was, I think, a awareness that we were ultimately going to have to militarize space, and
Mhm.
that there could be a variety of reasons for that. Not only because it would become part of combat on Earth, but it may also prepare us to deal with external threats, which are, I think, going
Yes.
to going to be. I don't, know it. I don't think necessarily that what we call today extraterrestrials or other civilizations will be hostile, but the likelihood is that they will develop hostile relationships if we don't find a way to accommodate once we encounter them, or if they don't find a way to accommodate with us.
I'd like to. I'm glad you brought that subject back in. You mentioned aliens earlier on. Of course, as our audience knows, the president has just released the first tranche ever, as far as I know, of Area 51 UFO alien type off-world activity. Um, I, I find this fascinating. Of course, I've always questioned it. As a little child, I just assumed there's got to be something beyond us on this one planet here. And but I think what do you think of the timing of the release of this? At the same time, 10 scientists reportedly are dead, five missing, namely David Wilcock in terms of death, as well as President Trump. I don't have the official statement in front of me. I'm sorry for that, but he terminated a board of these scientists that were established way back when. He terminated recently every one of them. So we have that happening. We have the scientists dead or missing or whatever. And at the same time, we're releasing UFO aliens, and the president's having fun with it. I mean, he's posting images of aliens and so forth. What do you make of this? And I have a follow up question concerning God and the difficulty people are going to have sorting this reveal out. And I think it's a drip, 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 and then a flood. We got the first drip. What's your analysis of this?
Well, the first information that was released was fairly innocuous. It was, objects moving in a way that we don't understand the mechanics of in space. But the reality is that, then certainly the discussion is that we have had the recovery of spacecraft with alien creatures that have been studied, and a lot of the materials that we have today that we take for granted have been developed by reverse engineering materials that came from outer space. And certainly some of the principles of travel that we see are involve a physics that we don't yet comprehend. I mean, if you read some of the physics that was described by Tesla, some of the advanced concepts of relativity into quantum physics, clearly there's going to be time travel mechanics that we today do not have the understanding to really put down into laws. We're fundamentally going to be changing our dynamics of how we conceptualize space time over the next 50 years in a massive reevaluation. Einstein was only the beginning. But
Mhm.
the realization that there is going to be other creatures and other civilizations, I think, is known. And there's a debate going on as to how to make that public information. And Donald Trump is kind of toying with it and will probably release a great deal more. But certainly when people have a hard time conceptualizing the Earth history going into billions of years. And you look at some of these Mesolithic stone structures, which involve these huge blocks of stone precisely cut into intricate structures, and they're all over the world, were done by a people that had different physics and different abilities than we have, which was largely lost over time for one reason or another. And even as a child, I thought that the nature of your Earth was, our planets were arranged in kind of, I always conceptualized it as a stepping stone. In other words, that an alien species could see a planet like Earth as a destination, but to get here to survive, they might have had to have gone onto a planet like Mars as a intermediate step, and then ultimately migrated after they adapted to Earth. And when they got here, they may not have been perfectly adapted, but over time they would mix with the creatures that were here, and the species would evolve into where their distinction as having come from outer space would have been forgotten. And certainly there were here on Earth pre-humanoids that were available for intermixing, which would have been a logical way for a foreign species, an extraterrestrial species, to have adapted to the planet. And many of the structures, the pyramids, other structures, are very hard to explain in terms of their intricacy and interaction with astrophysical events that are indications that very primitive people had a very deep understanding of how the Earth rotated and how the planets and the solar system revolved into periodic structures. So, Stonehenge and other structures are designed to be timepieces captured by measuring celestial events, which is very intricate and, involved an intelligence that was beyond the Neanderthal capability in another dimension, which had to have occurred, I believe, extraneously.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see responsibly how President Trump and the administration starts to reveal all this to the world. Fascinating time. I'd like to my producer.
He's going to have fun with it because he knows what the story is, and he's going to enjoy releasing it in his own fashion. I've known Donald Trump for over 40 years, and I have a remarkable appreciation of him.
Wow, that's great to hear. I certainly voted for him all 3 times, and grateful that God has intervened once again in the formation of this nation and then the restoration of it through Donald J. Trump. And I'm so grateful for that. I'd like to my producer to put up CorsiNation.com. Dr. Corsi, if you wouldn't mind, just share with our viewers a little bit about what they glean from this website. To our producer, if you can do a 3-panel and put up CorsiNation.com, we can have a brief discussion about that. There it is. The actual website itself. Talk with us, Dr. Corsi, a little bit about this and how people can connect up with you and your work.
Well, I've largely made this dormant. I've gone through, went through the Mueller investigation. They wanted to put me in prison. They thought I had the tie to Julian Assange. We can discuss that. But and I started doing podcasts again. But since 2018, when I was under investigation with the Mueller investigation, and they wanted desperately to put me in prison, they thought I had the last tie with Julian Assange that would have made the Russian collusion case. They said they were going to put me in front of a jury, and I would go they accuse me of lying and go to prison the rest of my life, or I could take a plea deal and say I had lied and had a tie to Assange, which would have been then the connection to Roger Stone and to Trump to have the disclosure of these emails that they said were stolen by Russia for the Democratic National Convention. Well, I knew Russia didn't steal the emails, and I knew that the emails would include Podesta's, but I did not have a tie to Assange. So I refused to take their plea deal, and they did not indict me. Instead, they closed down the Mueller investigation when they couldn't break me. And that was a miserable time in my life. And ultimately, my wife of 32 years wanted me to retire from politics. And she had an affair and divorced me, ended the 32-year marriage. And so I've gone through some miserable years. And what I've decided to do is I've gone back, and when I was in my 80s and 90s, I had a very successful career in financial services. I changed careers. So I decided to go back, and what I'm doing now is investment banking again. I went back to financial services. I've largely quit doing this site. So I discontinued my daily podcast and have suspended writing books for a while until I make more money doing investment banking. I enjoy financial services. And
Well,
I'm
that's it.
now trying to
Yes, go ahead, sir.
build companies that are part of the companies we're going to need for a mega future. And working very strongly with the people down in Mar-a-Lago who are connected to Donald Trump. And am very, very much involved in the financial structure of the future and funding companies that are going
Thank
to be
you.
part of the future.
I have some questions about these type of MAGA companies for the future in a moment, but let's talk about the global financial reset is what I call it, that we see underway. I'm going to throw a few things at the marker board, sir, and have you weigh in on this. And then I definitely would like to hear about what a little more detail about the future of business here in America, as you're talking about. We have March 26th, the Treasury Department publishing, I would call it a press release, that stated that this will be the first sitting president who's ever had a signature on the new currency. In the entire press release, nowhere were the words Federal and Reserve. What I see going on since 2020 is the dismantling of the Federal Reserve. We've got Powell out, Kevin Warsh in. I also see the dismantling of the IRS taking place one brick at a time. Wealth repatriation, we hear about that coming back to us in a variety of ways from Scott Bessent and the president himself, Elon Musk, as well as some economists and other folks. Then we see, last thing I'm throwing at the dartboard, if you will, the banks have been, we've known this for years, but now it's being more publicized. The banks naked short, the games they've been playing, and how they're caught now on the paper trade regarding gold and silver. I see us. Lastly, President Trump in the 2017 inauguration, of course, with the military behind him, stated, "I'm giving you back your country. We're restoring power back to the people." Well, as you well know, sir, we can't do that with money as debt, Federal Reserve, illegal and unconstitutional money. We got to restore that power back. And I believe that's exactly what this administration is presently doing. Am I wrong? And would you care to comment on what I threw at the dartboard? And then we'll segue that into the companies that you're discussing at Mar-a-Lago.
Well, it's a little bit more complex than that. I mean, we don't need a Federal Reserve, and we don't need to have we don't need to pay interest on our currency that's created. Jack Kennedy recognized that when he was publishing, Federal Reserve notes. Beyond Federal Reserve notes, they were Treasury notes. They were direct, as gold notes as they were almost. And I think I've got some $5 bills that he printed that were in that era. I'm going to leap ahead to give you one of the ideas that I think is going to be introduced, and that is that if you take cryptocurrency and you could pay Social Security in cryptocurrency, so someone young could say, well, we'll take XRP, and I own some XRP, just to pick one, that you could get your Social Security benefits in XRP, which is a private currency with the incentive to restrict its supply while increasing its use. So today XRP may be worth under $2, but in
Yes.
20 years that may be worth 20,000 units. Okay, so you could have a
Yes.
dramatic increase, and it would also achieve the effect of taking these non-discretionary payments, which is increasingly, 85% of the budget is headed towards. I mean, this is between Medicare, Medicaid, all these payments, these transfer payments that we're making, take them off the balance sheet. So they no longer be contingent obligations of the federal government, but they be paid in cryptocurrency. And the problem with the fiat currency is there's no incentive not to just increase its supply. And politicians will increase its supply endlessly in order to pay off obligations that they want to, give these people this money and these people that money. And then that sets up the ability to, give the money for welfare and then create structures and steal the money, which is what they've been doing for decades. And a lot of the money given out to, for instance, aid for family with dependent children, or the daycare, which we're finding now is a massive scheme. It's all just subject to being stolen. Well, if it were cryptocurrency, that'd be a lot harder to do. And if it were blockchain cryptocurrency, it could be regulated and controlled, and it would not be an obligation of the federal government. The federal government could have different kinds of currency. It could have a gold-based currency. It could have an international currency, which could be based on a bundle of goods. It could have a variety of currencies, not just one, and used for different purposes. Because again, the whole concept of money is just simply a convenient system of exchange, which means you don't have to carry around huge, metals and all kinds of other things. It can be done in a mathematical way and be really existing in kind of a cyberspace environment. We don't today have our currency in any tangible form. Maybe you buy a house, you've got some property, but even if you own stocks, it's really not very tangible. Very few people actually even get the stock certificates anymore. So the point is we're moving into a different conceptual basis of how money is going to operate and how systems of value are going to be created, and transactional systems to buy and sell are going to vary. But there's no reason these systems can't be created where it creates a much deeper middle class, while yet providing the basis for entrepreneurial activity and capitalism, which I think are the only fundamental ways you can motivate human beings to have a productive societies if there's gain on their labor, and if they have the opportunity to utilize capital to build wealth. But fundamentally, the money system that we've got now is broken beyond repair. And the debt we've got is untenable, and it will have to be ultimately itself probably paid off in cryptocurrency in order to be revalued and made into a form of transactional value that can be exchanged without causing huge interest to be paid. The problem with our systems are that these debt systems create unsustainable debt. And unsustainable debt is what broke the Roman Empire. It's what broke most of the countries. They died not from war, but they died from extensive debt and the deterioration of their middle class.
Well, President Trump, as you know, has stated numerous times, America's going to be the crypto capital of the world. And we know the Trumps are mining Bitcoin. I think Eric reported 2.5% of the Bitcoin. So great change is coming, quantum financial system, XRP, and various different ways to, as you've talked about, getting rid of money as debt. But I want to switch subjects because you're such a wealth of information. I'd love to talk with you periodically if we could and delve into so many subjects, but let's cover a couple of more issues. You mentioned that the deep state was, using you to help bring down Trump and so forth. Russia Gate, Mueller investigation. Now, fast forward to today. Comey's been arrested. It's been reported he could be facing 20 years in prison. I never thought I'd see this. I'm thrilled. You've got Brennan, Clapper, and the rest of the clan. We know who they are. Uh, they're all on the chopping block. They're the low-lying fruit next, in my opinion. Now that Comey is where in the seat he's in. Having said that, President Trump has stated this in press conferences, at cabinet meetings, on Truth Social, pretty much everywhere he goes, that all roads lead to Obama. He's made it very clear that Obama has committed treason. The DNI has the reports out. Kash Patel has the information. And this, my question to you, sir, is with Comey and the rest that are to follow, will all roads lead to Obama? And do you see justice being served?
Well, Obama is an intelligence agency creation. I mean, we found the birth certificate from which his was copied. And Joe Arpaio did a forensic examination of it. And there's 100% certainty that birth certificate presented for Obama was a fake. Okay,
Yep.
It's almost identically the birth certificate that I found in Hawaii. Okay, and traced it down. Okay, so he's a CIA legend, and the CIA was picking around his birth a group of black men that they thought would be president. They cultivated 8 or 10 of them, and Obama was the winner. Now, Obama was Muslim raised a Muslim in Indonesia. I believe Obama was Indonesian. I think his father was Subud. You can look up the pictures of Subud, and you can see it's identical. He ran a meditation cult out of Indonesia, and it operated in Indonesia, Hawaii, and Chicago. Loretta Fuddy, who was in charge of protecting the birth certificate in Hawaii, died in a plane crash, and she was a student of Subud. And Subud, just look him up on the internet. His pictures are identical to Obama. And genetics don't lie. Physical characteristics don't lie. Obama has no characteristics that are Luo tribe in Kenya. It's a joke. And all the research I did on that, even the Immigration Naturalization Service at the time, there was no evidence that Barack Obama Sr. and Ann Dunham ever lived together. And they were going to so they try to use the birth of this child as the reason that Barack Obama should get permanent citizenship because he has a child and married a citizen. They were going to deny it. The Immigration Naturalization Service, and that's in the record. We have documents that say that. Okay, so Obama, raised a communist, Frank Marshall Davis as his pseudo father, hated the United States and was determined to do everything he could to ruin the United States. I wrote a book called Abomination, which is #1 New York Times bestseller in 2008 when he ran for office. And yes, there are some indictments right now. I don't know yet that they'll be successfully carried out. General Flynn and I have nominated and written an article and talked, President Trump, we think Peter Titkin should be the Attorney General, not Todd Blanche. Todd Blanche is acting like a tough guy right now, but if he survives to be Attorney General, a lot of these investigations are going to go away. The deep state will be allowed to pass with maybe 1 or 2 scapegoats being put in prison. Maybe Brennan, maybe Comey, but largely the large number of people involved in the Justice Department, the CIA, who are still there opposing Trump, will not be brought to justice. Because again, the deep state protects itself and seeks to survive. It's more one world government, World Economic Forum in its fundamental conception, which is where the Dulles brothers always were after World War II. They weren't working for the United States. They were working for a future one world government, which they thought they would lead. and that battle is still being waged. And almost all the ideas that the left today believes don't work. Climate change was a scam. I wrote a book on that, Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change. Marxism has morphed. Marxism failed. The economic class did not rise up in 1848 like Marx expected. And by the time it got to the Frankfurt School and Gramsci, the communism was now attacking the culture of capitalism. And that with Marcuse, and it evolved into that, liberated sex was going to be the ultimate freedom of the human being. And so sex, drugs, and rock and roll became very popular. I wrote a book on that called Truth About Neo-Marxism, Cultural Maoism, and Anarchy. By the time you got postmodernism in it, Baudrillard and others, that they were saying, well, we don't know that there is any reality. It's what you think it is. It's your subjective experience. And so therefore you get critical theory and whatever some nutcase believes is their, sexual expression is their gender, and schizophrenia rules. There is no subjective reality any longer. And that's why, they're saying, well, they don't know what a woman is. They don't know where they are or what time it is or what day it is. There's no right or wrong. And the American people are saying these people are absolutely bonkers, which they are, but they want to be in control.
Without question.
They want to destroy. They want to destroy so that they can eliminate 2/3 or 3/4 of the world population and try to rule the world with their machines and their chips in their brains.
Yes. You mentioned a moment ago, sort of alluded to in your dialogue about on the Obama facing justice. In essence, our judicial system in the civilian side is corrupt, to say the very least. Very difficult to get anything accomplished. Having said that, let's turn our eyes on Gitmo, that little ground in Cuba. We know it's been heavily expanded. We know tens of millions of dollars have gone into it. We know there's a media center it's already constructed and about to be activated. And there have been ongoing activity from the JAGs and in tribunals, both investigative and prosecutorial. Do you see Obama, Clinton's, the big names? Do you see them being processed in Guantanamo Bay?
No, I don't think it'll happen. I think Deep State will protect them. I think it just be too much anguish to prosecute them. They're getting old. They're going to die. You might as well just let them go. Obama's wife can't tolerate him. His children don't agree with him politically. I mean, they just can belong in the dustbin of history. It's the same reason why Hitler was allowed to escape at the end of World War II. It was better just to let him get away than to bring him to justice. Bring him to justice, put him on trial, you give him another soapbox in which to propagate his nonsense. And so the American government decided that, even though and I've written a book on that, Hunting Hitler was a book that I first authored and then was picked up by, the History Channel and made into another series. But it was clear that the type of psychosis that Hitler had at the end of World War II doesn't marry Eva Braun and commit suicide and saying, I screwed up. He basically says, you people weren't worthy of me, and I'm going to escape and create it all over again. That psychology is not suicidal. It is. It'll kill everybody else around him, but he's not going to be suicided. So again, and I doubt that these people will face justice. If we get Peter Titkin in there, I think we could get more prosecuted that deserves to be, and we root these people out of the agencies and bureaus where they belong. I've been for reducing the size of the federal government by shutting down by bureau, close the Department of Education, close 10 of them, close all of them. There's no bureaucracy in the Constitution, and it's an unelected, Washington elite to move it out of Washington, D.C. Put these departments scattered across the country And the ones that are the most obnoxious, put them down in Death Valley and let them have all the wind and solar they want.
There you go. Let's close out this discussion, sir, with some of the very recent things that are occurring. The rededication to God, our nation's call to prayer, which just took place. We've got 49 days up till July 4th. These are important actions, important activities, and President Trump has uh, left what I call somewhat of a mystery sandwich as to some announcements he may be making on July 4th. What are your views of the rededication to God, our nation's call to prayer, and our 250th celebration on July 4th?
Well, I think the country has to come back to God. I think human beings without God are become vicious little demons, and we're spiritual beings, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. We get here, we don't know where we came from or where we're going. We're not here permanently. Nobody gets out of here alive. There's nothing of value you can take from here except your experience. And so therefore, any idea that this can be made permanent or this is what this experience is truly about is nonsense. And I think
Mhm.
people will come back and are coming back to God, and I think that's essential. Only because the
Yes.
complete demonic nature of what the left has created. I mean, the left, began in the 30s going communist. The Democratic Party became a communist party. Well, it's now moved
Yes.
way past that to go through to being an insurrectionist party or a treasonous party, and
Mhm.
now it's gone into a borderline demonic party whose ideas
Mhm.
are identical to satanic ideas, and they're
Yes.
cultivating and celebrating satanic rituals, practices, and beliefs. Well, that's a dead
Mhm.
end. I mean, that's that's going nowhere. And most people begin to realize that there's no future. There's no, that without families, without raising children, educating children, without proper values and morals, we just disintegrate very quickly into a nasty little cruel mob, and becomes
Mhm.
like Hobbes said, life is nasty, cruel, brutish, and short. Well, I often wondered in reading Hobbes whether he would have been happy if it had been nasty, cruel, and brutish as long as it was long. What he was most concerned about it was nasty, cruel, brutish, and to top it all off, it was short. And that was the greatest insult
Mhm.
to Hobbes that he could imagine.
Yeah.
And so that was probably the basis of his Christianity. What there was of it was the recognition that this was not a final solution or final destination of who we are.
Yes. So, we are spiritual beings, one would say, having a human experience, and we're at war of sorts, maybe not as kinetic as it's been in the past. Thank goodness for that. But we suffered greatly with the pandemic as one of the weapons to derail our elections and other things. But my question, I guess, is being that we're spiritual beings, we are at a spiritual war between good and evil, God and Satan, one might say. Um, Ultimately, how do you see this playing out? Who's the victor? How does it ultimately
Well,
play out for
I
us?
think this has been uh, fundamental to the human condition uh, always, and the awareness of the spiritual warfare has been, you know, always present. In the end, God always wins. I always say, in the end, God always wins. God did not create this experience to lose. The end has already been
Hmm.
written, and Satan
Yes.
loses. And so, therefore, the moral victory, the moral aspect of life, even though it seems to be the weakest, is the strongest because it is the only
Hmm.
true values. And so, therefore, the adherence to those values and the living according to them best as we can is the only true human dignity that we can achieve. And it's in recognition of our insignificance compared to God and our duty here to glorify God and to try to serve God. And once we
Hmm.
realize that, I think human beings can transcend from the nasty little brutish condition that Thomas Hobbes saw into the experience, at least periodically, of something transcendent. And that's part of the human
Yeah.
condition. Once we recognize our limitations and don't think our individual egos demand the attention that some want to give them.
Yes. Well, President Trump is leading the way and guiding us and bringing us back to a rededication to God. And as you stated, sir, God always wins, and that makes this an exciting time to be alive, in spite of some of the um, discomforts of the challenges and changes that we're going through as we start to redirect humanity on a course correction. Leaves me with my final question, sir. The golden age is a term that's resurfaced, if you will, as of the 2024 election. What does a golden age mean to you?
Well, there are different times in human experience when things are better or worse, and when they're a little bit better. The economy, we're not at war. We can feed people. People are generally thriving. We can handle disease. I mean, these are times when prosperity is. That's why I say peace through prosperity would be a golden era, and only golden era in that we're achieving our higher ability, our higher selves, as Abraham Lincoln
Mhm.
said. The higher angels of our nature are predominant in these periods of time when things come together well. But one of the great lessons of, I think, that was Plato and Aristotle recognized is how temporary these states are. That once it comes together, it begins to almost immediately fall apart. And so, therefore, it's very tough for human beings to maintain a golden era for any length of time, because the forces of
Mhm.
destabilization kick in pretty quickly once again. These battles never
Yes.
end, and I don't think they ever will end, although hopefully human beings will get a little bit wiser about it and be a little bit more attuned to the emergence of the negative forces when they begin to refute them early on, to extend golden eras. That's, I think, the best we could possibly do.
All right. Well, it's when you talked about the redirection and the unification of the Western Hemisphere, I think that is such a powerful statement, and I think that becomes a very, very important grounding force for the future of how we coexist here. Any closing comments regarding that?
Well, I mean, I remain hopeful that in the end, God does win, and that we have continued occurrence of people like Donald Trump or Abraham Lincoln or George Washington at the right times. There's always those who God, endows with the ability to guide us through these times. And I think if we continue to honor God, we'll have more of that rather than less. And the ability
Yes.
to raise children and to propagate them with the right values and to educate them is fundamental to our future as a species.
Well, thank you, sir. I'd like to extend an invitation in the near future, if you will, to just discuss in a conversation something we can delve into in greater detail. The work you're doing now regarding the MAGA world that we're in and entering into, some of the financial things and companies and structures and things that you alluded to earlier. I'd love to dive into that in greater detail in a future episode. Thank you, Dr. Jerome Corsi, for a lifetime of incredible work that you've done and documented in over 30 books and many other formats, as well as the
I think
work you're
it's
presently doing.
it's actually
Go ahead.
50 books. I finally
50.
got down. I've written 50 books in my life, and I actually went.
Wow.
I haven't actually cataloged them. I thought about doing that, but having moved, they're all boxed up now, and I'm still
Mhm.
transitioning from divorce into another stage of my life.
Understood. Well, our viewers certainly go to Amazon.com, and there's plenty of your published work there. I've seen that, and 50 books, incredible work, an incredible journey as a 5-year-old, piercing into the pulse of truth right out of the gate. has created a legacy of work, and I thank you for that, and so do the American people. Thank you, Dr. Jerome Corsi. Been an interesting discussion here in Conversations of Consequence. Look forward to hopefully speaking with you in the future about these companies and the financial subjects you alluded to. We'll sign off now. Thank you, sir, and I'll be right back.
Join Juan O'Savin, retired Lieutenant Colonel Matt Meck, retired Brigadier General Blaine Holt, and other prominent military and intelligence guests for an ongoing monthly broadcast with John Michael Chambers as your host here on jmcbroadcasting.com. The premiere episode launches Friday, September 26, 2025, and is sponsored by Genesis Gold. Visit jmcgenesismetals.com. This panel will address, among other subjects of great importance, what's taking place with the military tribunals, sealed and unsealed indictments, and the avalanche of arrests to come. Will justice be served? This and much more will be addressed each month, including an analysis of current events, making sense of the events as they unfold, one psyop after another. Detecting truth from lies in the dying age of fake news and the rising age of AI and digital enhancements will help you to remain focused and grounded in these most challenging, difficult, and dangerous final battles. A new day is dawning as this golden age is at the doorstep. Remain informed, empowered, and connected by an elite team of military and intelligence experts, and together we will save America. Subscribe for free at jmcbroadcasting.com and be sure to join us monthly. Eyes on Gitmo, wartime analysis. Nothing can stop what's coming, and the best is yet to come. Where we go one, we go all here at jmcbroadcasting.com.
I've been aware of the extensive work of Dr. Jerome Corsi for probably just about 3 decades, and it was a great opportunity for me to be able to sit down with him for this hour or so, and to peel back some layers of his insights from Eisenhower all the way to Trump. So great discussion. Thank you, sir. A quick announcement before we wrap up: all new Patriot Q&A hour. Join us May 28th, Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern, in our private Zoom room. 107 for 1 solid hour for the sole purpose of answering your questions. So get in there with us live. I will be your host. To register for this, you go to jmcbroadcasting.com, click on Premium Portal, and see if this is a fit for you. If it is, we definitely look forward to seeing you there. And thank you, Juan, for your time. On that note, I'll be meeting with Juan face-to-face soon. I won't give the date or the location, just out of privacy purposes, but I very much look forward to seeing Juan for a full day sit down again. The last time he and I had that opportunity was couple of 3 years ago, and I look forward to that. And it's coming up at the very beginning of June. Juan O'Savin, you can get close to him too, and get your questions answered from Juan, May 28th, 8 p.m. Eastern. I want to thank you for spending this time with us. Me and my guest, Dr. Jerome Corsi, and I'll be back next month here on Conversations of Consequence with another important voice for our times to sit down and have a discussion with. Don't miss our military, intelligence, economic, and soon to be launching in June, healthcare broadcasting. Sign up for free at jmcbroadcasting.com. Stay safe, everyone, and may God be with you.